afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our conversation, which is called Race in America. And our conversation is going to include three subtopics. We're going to talk about race and criminal justice. We'll talk about race and its intersection with policing. And we'll talk about race and opportunity or lack thereof. After our panelists have been introduced, they're each going to speak for just about 5 minutes, giving you a sense of the prism through which they will approach some of the questions that we'll have this afternoon. We'll do about a 20-minute or so moderated conversation, then we'll raise the lights and we will ask you to participate with your own questions. So we are ready to begin, and we'll begin at the way far end down there. Mayor Mitch Landrieu is the 61st mayor of New Orleans. He was sworn in on May of 2010, overwhelmingly reelected in 2014, and under his tenure, New Orleans has become the fastest growing major city in the United States. That's according to the U.S. Census, ranked #1 in metropolitan areas for overall economic recovery. His focus since his election has been on economic growth. New Orleans will remember its 10th anniversary coming up very soon this month. And also, in just a couple of years, we'll celebrate its 300th birthday. So it's nice to have you with us, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate it. Hakeem Jeffries is right next to him. He represents the diverse 8th Congressional District of New York, which is parts of Brooklyn and some of Queens, for those of you who are not locals from there. He's serving his second term, serves on the House Judiciary Committee and the House Education and Workforce Committees. He is an advocate for social justice and social change. His focus has been police reform, prison reform. He has his master's in public policy and a law degree from Georgetown University. It's nice to have you with us, Congressman. Thanks for joining us. And Darren Walker was appointed the 10th president of the Ford Foundation, the nation's second largest grant-making institution. He grew up in Ames, Texas, a student at Head Start, which had its roots in a Ford Foundation grant to Yale University. His focus is on social justice and social change, and it is nice to have you all with us this afternoon. So, Mayor Landrieu, I'm going to ask you to begin. Give us about a 5-minute presentation talking a little bit about the overall issue of race in America and the prism through which you see this conversation.
Soledad, thank you. And to Ben and Donna, thank you guys so much. This has been a great day so far. I want to kind of broaden out and then come down to the issue of race. I'm told that Stephen Sondheim lives somewhere around here. He's one of the greatest of all time, but he wrote a play called Merrily We Roll Along, and in one of the songs that he wrote called It's Our Time, the opening lyric is, something is stirring, it's all about. And my sense right now is, and I know they talked a little bit about it in the panel beforehand, that the rise of the Tea Party, the rise of all the people going to see Bernie Sanders, the upset in the streets that have resulted from the activities in New York or in Ferguson, et cetera, ought to be a clear signal to people who are out there watching, observing where America is at that time, that there is absolutely something stirring on the streets of America. And there are lots of reasons for it, but as it relates to cities like the city of New Orleans and other cities all across America, on the 3 subsets that you talked about, I want to be really clear about this. We are not in a post-racial America. I know that we thought we were going to get there one day. After Brown versus Board of Education, when the Supreme Court said with all deliberate speed, a lot of people said, thank God we're finished. And then after 40 or 50 years, we get the first African-American president of the United States. We said, oh, well, now we got there. I think it should be pretty clear to everybody that we have a problem with race. The first problem is it's very hard for us to talk about. We don't really know how to do it well, and we don't know how to do it in a constructive way. But what I see in the city of New Orleans, and I certainly see it in Baltimore, I certainly see it in Ferguson, is the African-American community is saying in a very specific way, this is not right. This does not work for us. And whether it's economic involvement, economic opportunity, the interrelationship with the criminal justice system, whether it's a whole bunch of other stuff, there is a sense that it's not working well, and that as you think about justice, whether it's economic justice or criminal justice, there's an uneasiness and an alienation that we have not really confronted in a way that is constructive. And I would just just say this to everybody. We are a very powerful nation. We're the most wealthy nation in the world. We have a lot of opportunities, and it's certainly true that we've made a tremendous amount of progress, but you really can't get where we're going if you leave anybody behind. We are a sum of parts, and if the parts of our nation don't have what it is that they need, don't have access to good education, don't have access to safe streets, are mistreated by the criminal justice system, have disparate treatment, et cetera, it creates an uncertainty and an alienation, which actually creates a division between, at least in the issue of criminal justice, between law-abiding African-American citizens and the police. And right now, I can tell you both of them are very confused. They're very confused about how to engage each other. They're very confused about how to talk to each other. You have a few bad cops and a few bad actors that are actually causing the rest of everybody else to pause for a minute, and because nobody's listening, to confront. And I think that we're in that moment in this country where we really have to stop for a second and look at this really, really hard, and to think about what it is we're seeing and to find a way constructively to get from where we are to a more peaceful place so that nobody gets left behind.
Congressman.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here. So many distinguished people in the audience, and of course, a very distinguished panel. I've got the distinct privilege of representing an incredibly diverse district in New York City, largely anchored in Brooklyn, as Soledad mentioned. Slight majority African-American and Caribbean-American, but there are Latinos and South Asians, the Orthodox Jewish community, Bangladeshi Americans, Chinese Americans, Turkish Americans. I represent more Russian-speaking Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union than any other member of Congress in the country. What a great country we are. Who knew? Hakeem Jeffries. So, as you would suspect, you know, the gorgeous mosaic of the nation anchored in Brooklyn through the lens of this congressional district, with a lot of commonalities running through all of those different diverse communities that I try to put together and channel on their behalf. But I think one would have rose-colored glasses if they didn't recognize, particularly given the events of the last year, that while we've come a long way, as the mayor mentioned, we still have a tremendous way to go. And I think particularly for the African-American community, and I say this on behalf of those that I represent, and also, you know, in connection with my membership in the Congressional Black Caucus and talking to other members who represent African-Americans all across the country, that the events of the last year have really shaken a lot of people in terms of just how far have we come in America. And what happened in Ferguson, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Walter Scott in North Charleston, Freddie Gray, so many other incidents all happening within a year period, have caused, I think, a lot of African Americans to question whether race is an issue that will ever be able to overcome here in America. I had a conversation with a senior senator who said something I thought was very profound. We were talking about a different issue, but he said that he thought just as anti-Semitism seems to be in the soil of Europe, there's a great concern that racism is in the soil of America. And the question is, can you ever really shake that? I've got to believe that we can, but I think there's also a reality that as we've made significant progress over the last 150 years or so in particular, every time there's been progress on the question of race in America, that's often been followed by a significant backlash. And if you look at what occurred in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Civil War and the North prevailing, the Reconstruction Amendments that were passed, 13th Amendment, of course, making slavery illegal, the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law of due process, 15th Amendment, trying to guarantee everyone the right to vote regardless of race. But then that was followed by a significant period in the South of retrenchment. The black codes, Jim Crow, lynching, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1892. And we really didn't begin to come out of that period in the South until the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And I would argue, being from Brooklyn, Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in 1947, 5 years before Brown. But we begin to come out of that period and again seem to make significant progress in America. Jackie Robinson, Brown v. Board of Education, momentum in Congress, Martin Luther King's civil rights movement starting down in Alabama, moving into the 1960s, and then of course the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, probably culminating with the 68 Fair Housing Act, and then again a period of backlash and retrenchment. Richard Nixon, of course, gets elected in '68 as a result of employing in large part the Southern strategy, what history seems to show, a deliberate attempt to capitalize on the fear, perhaps, of the rise of African Americans in certain segments of society amongst certain aspects of the white community, certainly not all, but a clear and deliberate strategy, then taking advantage of a movement against affirmative action, anti-busing, and things of that nature, retrenchment. And then, of course, there was the feeling in closing that the president gets elected in 2008, and is this the moment of a post-racial society? And of course it's not. That's become shown. I think it's just another example of a threshold, an additional threshold being overcome, more progress being made, but again, perhaps not to the same degree, a period of backlash and retrenchment. And I would suggest that the Tea Party movement isn't anchored in that largely. I think it was anchored in economic frustration and misdirected anger against the president and those who were in power. But we've certainly seen certain elements of racism in a variety of the movements that have risen up, perhaps in response to the election in part of President Obama, but simply an indication that as we make progress in America, there's always been a backlash. We always have to confront that backlash and continue our long, necessary and majestic march toward a more perfect union.
Thank you. Darren?
Yeah. Well, I would agree very much with what Mitch and Hakeem have said, and I think, so much of the ethos of this country is our collective view of who we are as a nation. And when you look over the narrative arc of American history and you begin, say, with de Tocqueville, who wrote so elegantly and passionately about the uniqueness of America with, clearly an exalted view. But even de Tocqueville reminded America that its greatest threat was not external. It was the fact that the nation had been founded on slavery. De Tocqueville wrote extensively about this. Now, this part of the de Tocqueville story with America is rarely told. We only hear the exalted part of what de Tocqueville said in our narrative that we've constructed. But he was very clear about the status of slaves and Native Americans. And when you bookend de Tocqueville and the election of Barack Obama, what I find so interesting is the ebullient way in which we all imagine what the election of President Obama would mean for race, racial progress. And the irony is that President Obama, until recently, has been almost impotent in his capacity to really take this on head on. In part because the pollsters told him that Americans didn't want a black president to talk about the needs of African Americans because America didn't elect a black president for black America. We elected a president for America. And so it's no surprise that for 6 years, we could probably count on one hand the number of times he engaged beyond the superficial in the issue of race. Now, more recently, I think he has become far more bold and authentic on the issue. But I think even he was constrained in his ability to engage in a conversation on race. And so it's emblematic, I think, of a larger challenge that we have in this country that gets back to how difficult it is for us to internalize who we actually are with our mythologized view of who we are. And I think what has happened in the last year or two is both the combination of technology that makes it really clear who we are. I mean, the fact we have not just seen an increase in the last 2 years in police brutality against African American men. I mean, we now have it on videotape, and we now can see it instantaneously. And I think we're all so find it so abhorrent, and we're all so appalled by it that we can't deny. We have to come to grips. It forces us to come to grips with that reality. The challenge is, what do we do about it? And this is why I'm actually quite sympathetic to the question that white Americans often ask. Well, what do you want us to do? And we've heard it before. People say, well, my grandfather came to this country in 1912. We had nothing to do with slavery. And you hear these kinds of narratives from many Americans who are frustrated and share the concern, but also are confounded by what are the solutions. And in fact, there are solutions. And certainly these two gentlemen have been working very hard on putting forth solutions.
So we'll talk about some of the problems and some of the solutions, although you point out an interesting dichotomy, right? This idea of we have this collective view of who we are as Americans, but at the same time, even the black president's like, ixnay on talking about the black stuff until I feel comfortable enough that I'm not going to scare the pollsters. So there is clearly a disconnect between how white Americans and black Americans in communities see policing and see criminal justice. What does close that gap? I mean, how do you have people jump into other people's lived experience? What do you do? What's worked? What's
not? I think part of what we're seeing is, for the first time, the latest Times poll showed that a majority of Americans actually agree, for the first time since polling has been done, that we have a race problem in this country. We have always had asymmetry between where African Americans, for example, have viewed and where average whites. That gap is actually closing now for the first time. And I think this past year is part of why it is.
I agree. I think the sort of parade of horribles that have taken place over the last year have helped to crystallize amongst many Americans, not simply African Americans, that there is a significant race problem that has to be addressed. And to Darren's point, I think part of that, of course, is that many of these horrific incidents were actually caught on videotape. And undeniable that there was, in the view of many, an injustice. I see that through the lens of the Eric Garner case, of course, that took place in Staten Island, back home in New York City, where you had a situation for all the world to see, African-American individual who was approached, of course, because he was allegedly selling loose cigarettes, and as a result got the death penalty for it with a chokehold that was illegally deployed based on NYPD regulations. Someone cries out for his life 11 times, 11 different occasions. More than 6 officers refused to intervene. Medical examiner says that the death was caused by asphyxiation. It was a homicide. And then a year later, you have a situation where, grand jury returns no true bill. Eric Garner's dead. The police officer who was responsible for that death is still on the job being paid. Person who took the videotape has actually been indicted for other relatively minor crimes in what many view as retribution from some local law enforcement officials. And then the prosecutor who presided over the miscarriage of justice gets your promotion and is elected to Congress. And so you can't make this up. And I think that particular incident, as it all unfolded, the entire trajectory of it captures so many different aspects of what is wrong in America that it's helped to crystallize that we've got a criminal justice problem at the outset in terms of who's being targeted for certain offenses. This was a minor administrative offense, didn't require the NYPD, maybe the New York State Tax Department in some way, shape, or form. Certainly not 6, 8, 10 officers. Excessive force is then used. A death results, no indictment, no seeming consequences on the criminal side. And I found it interesting in Congress that the reaction was very different to Ferguson amongst my colleagues. Democrats and Republicans had two very different conclusions as to what took place. African Americans and whites, two very different conclusions as to what may have occurred. But there was almost a uniform condemnation, either vocally or in personal conversations with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, conservatives and others, who Garner was a triggering event. It seemed that something's wrong in America and we got to do something about it.
So I said that this was really hard to talk about and it's dangerous. So I'm gonna poke the pig, and try to go a little bit deeper and create at least some clarity on why I think there's some confusion. I think that, first of all, most police officers are really good folks. They work really, really hard. They work and live in dangerous situations. These are African American, Hispanic, Vietnamese cops as well. And there are clearly, there's no question about this, some bad police officers that do the wrong thing for the wrong reason, and police departments that don't hire appropriately, supervise appropriately, or have accountability measures that are appropriate. I think that that's not controvertible. I don't think that that is open for debate, especially since we've now seen videos. All of my police officers now have body cameras on them. We film everything, and we think it's great, and we're under the supervision in New Orleans of a consent decree. It's clear to me, too, because of, as a mayor, and of course you know this as well because you just had community meetings, if you're close to your district, you can feel the heat or you can feel the peace. You know when there's something wrong. If you're doing something wrong, the public's going to tell you about it and get upset. When you have people marching in the streets, for whatever reason, it means something's going on. And when the whole movement of Black Lives Matter, when so many people went to Ferguson and stayed for so long, I, as a mayor, really kind of asked myself, what is that about? You know, when you say Black Lives Matter, what is essentially that about? And I think what the Congressman was talking about in terms of the Garner case is there was a bad action, somebody died, and then the criminal justice system did not seem to treat that situation appropriately. And as a consequence, what I've been hearing and what you're seeing and hearing from the African American community is this is evidence of disparate treatment. And by the way, that disparate treatment is universal, and African Americans, not just poor folks, but lawyers, doctors, et cetera, have had a negative experience with the police department. And white America, you need to wake up, because if my life mattered as much as yours, you would help me do something about it, because if it was your kid, you would do it too. That's my sense of what that is. But I have another problem in New Orleans that confuses me. And as soon as I raise this issue, because when real conservative folks raise it, they use it as an excuse for not having the responsibility to do anything. I'm not raising it for that reason, but I'm going to give you the fact. In terms of who's being killed in America every day on the streets of America, 14,000 American citizens are being killed every year. I told you that the other day that 628,000 American citizens have been killed since 1980, which is more American citizens killed in all of the wars of the 20th century. That ought to make you stand up. A lot of talk here about the Iranian deal and everything that's going on over there because we're afraid of our homeland and we're afraid of terrorists coming over here to kill us while we are killing each other at rates that are astronomically higher than anything that we've seen in a long period of time. But the overwhelming majority of victims are African-American men and boys. And I don't see anybody. I know that people have marched for this. I know that people have confronted this issue, but I don't see long marches for 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 weeks. And some people say, well, geez, what is that about? I can tell you this, though, whose fault it is or why it happens. The consequence of that activity, when every day in America 40 people are killed on the streets of America, and it's happening all over, and you got it in New York, even though the murder rate's been reduced. In the African-American community for men, the per capita number for violence is 100 times the national average. And when people talk to me about Black Lives Matter, I ask myself, well, do all African American lives matter? Because of course, anybody that's been involved in a police officer, African American male situation, and the criminal justice system doesn't work, a lot of attention, it's needed, it's necessary, it absolutely has to change. We have to get better. What I'm really concerned about every day as the mayor is peeling the young kid off the street that got his heads blown off 85% to 90% of the time by somebody that he knew. Now, for my city and in certain neighborhoods, that is a stratospherically debilitating thing for the families and the kids who live in those neighborhoods and their capacity actually to stand up. And I have really been searching very, very hard and being very forward about trying to make sure that this conversation is thoughtful and real. And what I've run into is kind of the right versus the left. No, you can't talk about that because you're blaming the victim. Now you're trying to ignore this. And what I'm saying is, just like it takes to get a guy out at first base, it takes the short top. He's got to throw the ball, and the first baseman's got to catch it in order for that play to be whole. What I'm telling you is that both of these issues are important, they're complementary, and they're necessary, and neither one of them can be fixed if we don't really confront what the Congressman and Darren said, is that a lot of this has to do with race, a lot of this has to do with history. You cannot, in my opinion, legitimately take the position that slavery and the progeny thereof, the consequence of the Code Noir, which you talked about a little bit early, the subsequent kind of futile attempt to get us into integration and then the backlashes are not still coursing through the veins of America. And it doesn't mean that we're bad people. It just means that we haven't fixed it yet. We absolutely can fix it, but in order to fix it, you gotta accept that it's still a problem. And when folks are in the street and they're telling you it's a problem, you know what? Whether you agree with them or not, they're agitated. And when they're feeling alienated, America at some level becomes weaker, because if in fact young African American men are spending their time in prison and therefore not being able to take care of their families, or they're unemployed, 52% of African American men are unemployed in the city of New Orleans, by the way. And guess what? It's not just in my city, it's all over the place. And they're not putting in, but they're taking out, and or they're causing problems, and or they're in difficulty, in harm's way. It means that the country's not pulling at its weight the way it's supposed to be. And at the end of the day, we become weaker as a country, and our national security is threatened, when in fact we have to be, in order to be strong, everybody in America's got to be strong. And that's why I think it really is, in some very real way, not just this little bitty thing where we have to take care of 10% of the population because it's the right thing to do. It's an existential threat to the future of our country in terms of economic growth and national security. And that's why white people really need to care about this. This is not just about people in another neighborhood that don't look like us.
Is that a race issue or is that an economics issue? I'm sure if you were to go and drill down, you'd see an intersection, right, of that subset of young black men who are being killed actually overlaps completely with poverty and lack of opportunity and lack of access to opportunity, and probably historical lack of access to opportunity for their parents and grandparents. So are we talking about race, or are we really talking about class issues in America that seem to be becoming more stratified and more, bigger distance between them?
We're talking about both. I mean, I think when you talk to sociologists, they will say that this is a combination of, as most challenges like this are in our system, at the intersection of race and class. Because we have challenges around inequality and the attitudes of African Americans who have succeeded in our society and who have points of view, unfortunately, far too often about those of us who have not succeeded, which in some ways play into the hands of conservatives who really, I question the sincerity of a desire to really make progress. But I think what the mayor is saying about challenging African American leaders in particular on this issue of black on black crime in a city like Chicago, which you know has far worse numbers than you do in New Orleans, where in a weekend 15 people are killed on the South Side, and it barely registers. Barely registers in the media. On the one hand, this is partly why the Black Lives Matter movement has taken off. It's because in the city of Chicago, 100 people, 100 young African-American men are killed in a month, and sometimes in 2 weeks over the last 2 years, and there's but a blip about it. And so there is, again, this narrative going back to lynching and all other sorts of injustices where the actual humanity of Black men in particular has been devalued in our culture, and it continues today. Now, who's culpable for it, I think, is the real question that you're getting at. And I think it takes courageous mayors like you, courageous congressmen like Hakeem, who are going to hold other leaders account to move beyond this rhetoric, and often the rhetoric that is this binary, that you're either, the police are bad, and that's where the problem is. The problem is not even the police. The problem is the criminal justice system. The police are one feature of a criminal justice system that is biased and that in some ways seems to be constructed for social control, not really for social harmony or cohesion.
There are interesting, strange bedfellows on this issue of prison reform. You certainly are on a work with folks across the aisle to deal with that. And what has been the biggest challenge in making that work, Congressman? And would you be more than happy to sit down with the Koch brothers, who seem to be anathema to Democrats everywhere, and say, yeah, let's do a press conference together and talk about prison reform? Would that not help your career?
That's an interesting question. But I will say the emergence of strange bedfellows has been, perhaps one of the most encouraging parts of my time, my short duration in the United States House of Representatives, all of which has been spent on the Judiciary Committee. And when I first arrived, I was appointed to a House task force on overcriminalization. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, nonpartisan or bipartisan, evenly divided approach to reviewing some of the issues in the criminal justice system confronting America. And from the outset, I was impressed by the fact that there seemed to be a real genuine interest on the right to explore the problem of overcriminalization in America. Now, some of that has to do with the notion that there's a feeling that administrative activity, administrative abuse, has been overly criminalized in a way that is not good for America, that is not good for a business. But as I dug deeper, it certainly has gone beyond that in ways that I think could be helpful to ultimately arrive at a resolution, hopefully before this president leaves office. You've got fiscal conservatives who sort of post-2008, particularly in some deep South states, came to the conclusion, one, that the exploding prison population was not sustainable and perhaps was not producing the results from an economic efficiency standpoint that made any sense. Huge cost to economic productivity and human capital. Fiscal conservatives increasingly interested in reforming our criminal justice system. And then it became clear to me through much of the work that I've been doing on this issue that you've got Christian conservatives, another important part of sort of the Republican coalition, who theologically, who inherently believe in the principle of redemption and the notion that once someone has paid their debt to society, they should be given a second chance. And that strand has become increasingly interested in sort of reentry and rehabilitation and eliminating some of the collateral consequences that have traditionally existed to criminalization in America that prevent people from getting a second chance. And then it became clear to me that there was actually a third strand, Soledad, the Tea Party libertarians, who inherently are suspicious of government overreach. And so my libertarian friends in the House don't like over-regulation, don't like over-taxation, but increasingly don't like over-criminalization and see it as another, in their view, big, inefficient government program. And as I've said to many of them, if you are concerned about overreach, there's no greater area of concern, I would think, than when the government can inappropriately take someone's liberty away. And that's their position. And so a few months ago, the president convened a meeting. It was very interesting because it was Democrats and Republicans, members of the Senate, members of the House. To my right was Trey Gowdy, who, of course, has become famous for other reasons as the lead inquisitor of the Benghazi Commission. But he was seated immediately to my right. And Rand Paul was to my left. Now, he's not really to my left on most issues, but it was an example of the number of individuals who are willing, it seems, to invest time and energy in this effort to get something over the top with the Koch brothers and Grover Norquist and Newt Gingrich and Heritage and other far right or right-wing forces willing to partner in the effort to get something accomplished. And it's one of the things that I'm hopeful we can get done in America and in the Congress this year.
You forgot to answer the last part of the question. Yeah. So, press conference with the Koch brothers and Grover Norquist and Heritage. Helpful, not helpful?
Helpful in that one of the things I found in the House, particularly in this climate of great dysfunction in Washington, where Americans rightfully have come to the conclusion that you guys can't get anything done in Washington or work together for the good of America. Whenever you can present a picture of individuals who perhaps don't agree on a whole host of things ideologically in other areas, but can agree on this, that it's a great launching pad for the prospect that perhaps there's capacity to get something over the finish line in Washington, D.C. So sign me up.
Let me add this. I completely agree with everything that the Congressman said. But be aware of this. 75% of the prisoners in this country in state prisons. A smaller percentage of them are on the federal level. So all of their discussions are about federal laws. And so the question will be, if they succeed, and I'm very hopeful that they will, and I think that this is a great moment that we should seize in this country and do this, is that theme and that theory will get itself down to the ground. Now also remember, too, that if you're talking about criminal justice reform, we're talking about the fact that a lot of our citizens are in prison. We incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. In the state of Louisiana, we incarcerate more people than any other state in the nation. And we need to think about why people are there and how long they should stay. Now, clearly, most Americans, I think, are fair-minded people. They're fiscally prudent. And you don't want to make unwise investments. And so what the Congressman knows, and all of you knows, if you put somebody in prison who does something, right now, because of the way we do stuff, the recidivism rate is about 85%. So you put them in there, they get a sentence, then our returning citizen comes out, there's an 85% chance that he's gone back, which you pretty much wasted your money. If, in fact, you're trying to produce something that creates a result that's beneficial. And so we have to be open to think about how we secure our streets. Everybody wants to be safe. Let me tell you who wants to be the most safe. Poor African-American citizens in tough neighborhoods when their kids are going to school. They have this at a much higher degree than wealthier white citizens in neighborhoods who are afraid that when we say making your groceries, going to the grocery store and moving back, whether somebody's going to hit you on the head when you go on in your house. And so I think this is an issue whose time has come, part A. Part B, I would say this in response to what Darren said a little bit earlier. The kind of fight that goes on that people don't really talk through, and this kind of goes into income inequality, and whether it's institutional or whether you're talking about opportunity inequality or institutional inequality, where's personal responsibility? You hear the other side say, well, this is all about personal responsibility. People would just act right. Daniel Moynihan wrote the epic piece on this years ago. Government on its best day can't replace a family. It just can't. And there are institutions that nurture human beings, the church, not-for-profits, family, et cetera, that have frayed not just in African-American communities, but all over America as well. And income inequality and crime will both be affected when we find a way to strengthen those institutions. So that's part of it as well. And then finally, personal responsibility is a part of it. You hear a lot of, Charles Blow told a very compelling story the other day about a bad incident that happened in his life, and he was very angry, and he grabbed a gun, and he was on his way to kill somebody, and he checked himself. He was able, for that moment, to say, I am not going to do that. And as hard as that is for some of these young guys that live in my city who say, man, out here, it's rough. Man, you either kill or be killed. Somebody kills them this is where interrupters came from in Chicago ceasefire. Within 72 hours, they're going to reach back. We've got to find a way to change that ecosystem of violence. And then finally, the third piece, Darren said just a minute ago, it's hard to find out like whose fault it is. I would just like posture this as a constructive way to go forward. We're never ever going to agree on whose fault it is. We've been fighting that fight now for a long, long time, and people keep pointing their fingers with each other. I would just like to call a truce on that question, or if people don't want to call a truce, let them go in academia and try to decide that. But for our purposes, I would just like to say this. I don't know whose fault it is, but I know whose responsibility it is to fix it, and I know who will benefit from it if we take this moment in American history and get this right. And I'm actually very optimistic about the next 10 to 15 years of the country. I think we have a really great chance here. And if the Koch brothers showed up and they got that big money and they're gonna lay it down and their interests are consistent with mine, I'll crawl across the street to get it if I think it's gonna help, even though I don't like them very much. But politics is not about, right, friends and enemies. It's about common interest, and it's about getting a deal. And it's not about the person who's giving it. It's about whether you're gonna get to a place. And I think that this is a great time. And if Rand Paul's gonna sit there and he's going to partner with the congressman, or the Koch brothers want to partner with Soros, I said, let's get at it and get there fast.
And I think the Koch brothers, as you say, Mitch, the most people in penitentiaries are in state penitentiaries. State legislatures have governance over state penitentiaries. And at the state level, it is actually mostly Republican governor states that are housing most of the prisoners in this country. And so we've got to have influence in those places. And so we made a grant, which of course was written about on the front of the New York Times because it was such a, Left-Wing Forward Foundation makes a grant to a partnership with the Kochs. Well, it's exactly for the reason Mitch says. They can be more effective, quite frankly, than the NAACP or the Urban League with the Louisiana legislature and with the Georgia legislature, where all of these black and brown men are incarcerated. So we've got to figure out a way to pragmatically solve these problems and get out of our ideological boxes.
And I should also
So
point out
I'm going to stop you there because we've raised this lights, and I want to open it up to the audience for some questions, and hopefully they'll ask exactly the question that will get to the answer that you wanted to give. A couple of quick ground notes for this questions. Raise your hand so we can bring you a microphone. Please tell us your name when you get that microphone, and remember there should be a question in your question, or I will stop you. I will interrupt you, and we will move on to someone else. Carry on.
It's a question, don't worry. My name is Megan McQuinney. I would ask, on a state or federal level, what would you decriminalize or provide amnesty for? What change would you make judicially or prosecutorially that you think would drive the most change to affect this problem?
Well, one of the things that we're looking at is trying to deal with the mandatory minimum sentences that were imposed during sort of the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in an effort by both Democrats and Republicans, quite frankly, sort of the law and order crowd, aggressive law and order crowd, to deal with what was a legitimate scourge that was ravaging many inner city communities, certainly down in New Orleans and Brooklyn, where I represented all across America. But that went too far, as most people now acknowledge, where we were sending people for drug crimes or drug activity that was nonviolent for far too long, 10, 20 years, mandatory minimums, no discretion applied, to the point where in the federal system at least, you've got 50% of the people who are currently incarcerated are there for largely nonviolent drug-related crimes. Another 20 or so % are there for administrative crimes, public order offenses. 8% of the people who are currently incarcerated in the federal system are there for violent crimes. Now, that's a macro problem that we've got to confront, because clearly that's not the balance that any criminal justice system should have. And at the state level, I agree with what both the mayor and Darren said. We've got to find a way in the momentum that has been created in Washington to influence in some ways the activity that takes place in the state, because the federal government is partially responsible for creating this problem. You know, in the early 1970s, the war on drugs begins. There's about 350,000 people incarcerated across America, the majority at the state level, of course. Before the crime bill was passed in, I think, 1994, there were approximately 900,000 people that were incarcerated in America. A little over 20 years later, there's more than 2 million. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated population. China's got more than 3 times the number of people that we have in America. We incarcerate much more people than China does. And part of the reason that happened is that in that crime bill in 1994, we incentivized states to build prisons by providing billions of dollars and required those states to impose some of these harsh sentences at the state level as well. And so many of us are saying we got to fix the federal problem, but because the federal government helped create the state incarceration problem across America, we've got to creatively figure out ways to incentivize best practices in 2015 in the way that, with the hindsight of 2020, bad practices were incentivized in 1994.
Let's take another question from the audience. Right down here.
You take your.
I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm still involved with Cleveland. And I was wondering what you think is going to happen if they do not indict the people in the murder of Tamir Rice. And what will happen if the city starts rioting in the same way they did in Ferguson and more burn the city, which is what people think may happen. How do you think we can avoid the outcomes that are so against what people believe happened in that case, with the 2 policemen, one of which had already been fired from a position in a smaller town in Ohio? You
Thanks,
know
Ms.
the
Gunn.
story, I know.
Yep, we
but
do.
A lot of people don't really know that
So
story.
Darren, why don't you start with it for us?
No, I'm not a prognosticator on these, but I think that, again, the rage that is manifest is much bigger than the fact pattern of a particular case. The reality is what happened in Ferguson, when you read the Justice Department's report on what actually happened, it actually doesn't match the rage that we're all feeling. Right? The Justice Department in some ways absolved Darren Wilson. And in fact said, Michael Brown, reached for the gun. There were things that were clearly different than the Eric Garner situation there. But I think the reason, whether it's in Cleveland, Aggie, or in Ferguson, is because these are metaphors for much more profound injustices in our society. And these are the fulcrums through which people can voice that rage and be heard on the issues. And I wouldn't be surprised, given the situation in any any city in this country, which is highly combustible. It is a tinderbox. And so you could absolutely see that kind of Ferguson situation.
Congressman, if I might, the African-American community has not lost its mind. There is justification, and the events of the last couple of years should indicate to everybody that even though, as Darren said, the specific facts of a particular case may or may not meet the overarching thing, the fact that the rage is so deep, we shouldn't say, as a lawyer would say, it's used to prove the truth of the matter asserted. It's actually for a bigger thing. This is really complicated because literally lives hang in the balance, the lives of a police officer and the lives of this. In the New Orleans, I found that our community is very thoughtful and reasonable. We have had a number of police-involved shootings. When one of them occurred, in both of them actually, there was an immediate response by an independent police monitor, by a federal monitor, who went out. There was a thorough investigation. It was an objective investigation. And one of them led to them saying that was a bad shooting. The police officer did the wrong thing for the wrong reason, and that police officer is now serving time in jail. He was wrong. There was another instance when the police pulled over two guys, young African-American men, white police officers. The guys got out of the car with guns. There was a gunfight ensued, and two of the young African-American men found themselves dead, and two police officers were shot. They did the same kind of investigation, and in that instance, the police officers were not arrested. And they said it was a justifiable shoot. In both of those instances, other than the families, which were upset in both instances, the community writ large said, we think that the system worked the way it did. My sense of what you're feeling is that when the community feels like the system is rigged and it's treating similarly situated people differently because of their race, then they will appropriately say there's a difficult circumstance. I don't know what the temperature is in Cleveland right now, and I don't know enough about the specific facts of the case to even venture a guess. I would simply say this, that if there's no social cohesion, if the politicians and the ministers are not talking, if the families and the community are not talking, if there's a complete dissection between the white community and the black community, there is a much more chance that there's going to be an explosion, because alienation produces that, which actually goes to the issues that you were talking about with income inequality, resilience. This is why we need to really pay attention to this, because this is happening way too much. And it's a sign that we are much, much more disconnected, and that the issue of race has not yet been resolved, because people aren't clear about whether it's race or is it class. Is it institutional racism or is it personal responsibility? And because the ball's in the air and lives hang in the balance, temperatures are really, really hot. I would recognize as a social scientist or a political scientist in this regard, when people are yelling and screaming, they're usually yelling and screaming about something they care about. And you need to address it, because it's not just going to go away. And when you have something that's as serious and as deep as this, and you speak to the issue that you spoke to a little bit earlier, because it was very poignant, that from the senior senator, about whether or not it's built into our soil. You know, the good thing is he didn't say, is it built into our DNA? You can get it out of the soil, but you got to recognize that it's there. And I think that this is clear to us that it's there, and, you know, we ignore it, in my opinion, at our peril.
That's going to be our final word. A big round of applause, please. Mayor Landrieu, Congressman Jeffries, Darren Walker, thank you. And thank you for your questions. Appreciate it.
Final word, man. Enjoyed it. Absolutely. I'll let you know whenever I come down to your great city.